The dry soil was wrong. 10-year-old Maya knew soil. She knew the soft, dark earth near the creek that was good for finding worms, the packed clay behind the group home that skinned your knees, and the dusty, sun-baked dirt of the abandoned construction site that smelled like heat and forgotten things. This patch of earth, tucked away behind a copse of thirsty-looking pines at the edge of the new fence line, was different. It was a mound, but not a natural one. It was a hastily piled scar, littered with freshly snapped roots and paler, damper soil from deep beneath the surface. It looked like a secret someone had tried to bury in a hurry. Her breath hitched. A rule from her fourth and final foster home echoed in her head. "Don't go looking for trouble, Maya. Trouble will find you soon enough." But another, older voice, her father's, whispered a different lesson. "Pay attention to the details, little bird. The world talks to those who listen." She listened now. The only sound was the buzz of a lazy fly and the frantic thump of her own heart against her ribs. Crouching low, her worn sneakers pressing into the loose dirt, she saw it. A glint of metal, not a rock, not a piece of trash. It was a small silver eagle, the kind you might see on a belt buckle, caked with dirt but unmistakable. Beside it, a single finger, thick and calloused, poked through the soil, its nail torn and bloody. The finger twitched. A strangled gasp escaped her lips, a sound she immediately swallowed. Terror, cold and sharp, pierced through her. This wasn't a secret. This was a grave, and the person in it was still alive. She scrambled backward, crab walking away from the mound, her eyes locked on that twitching finger. Her mind, a place usually filled with the quiet observations she captured in her sketchbook, went white with panic. Run! The instinct screamed at her. Run back to the sterile silence of the group home, lock her door, and pretend she had seen nothing. No one would believe her anyway. They never did. She was the quiet girl, the one who drew instead of talked, the one whose files were thicker than her friendships. But then the finger moved again, a desperate, weak curl, as if reaching for a sky it could no longer see. It wasn't just a body, it was a person fighting. Her father's voice returned, calm and steady in the chaos of her thoughts. "Courage isn't about not being scared, little bird. It's about doing the right thing, even when you are." She took a shuddering breath, the dusty air burning her lungs. She looked from the horrifying mound to the long, empty road that stretched past the construction site, a ribbon of scorched asphalt under the unforgiving sun. Running away would keep her safe, but it would leave him to die. In that moment, a choice was made. Her small, thin legs, so used to carrying her away from danger, began to pump, not toward the false safety of the home, but toward the road, toward the sound of distant thunder that wasn't a storm, but something else entirely. Maya's life had been a series of closed doors and shrinking rooms. It began with the screech of tires on wet pavement, a memory that existed only in fractured, nightmarish flashes. She was 6. One moment she was in the back seat, drawing a picture of her family as superheroes, her father the driver, her mother the navigator, their laughter the engine. The next, there was shattering glass, a violent lurch, and then a profound, terrifying silence. She woke up in a hospital, a kind nurse explaining that her parents were gone. They had become stars, the nurse said, smiling sadly. But Maya knew better. Stars were distant and cold. Her parents had been warm. The system took her then. It was a place of paperwork and overworked caseworkers who spoke in acronyms and tired sighs. Her first foster home was with a woman who had too many cats and not enough love to go around. Maya was just another mouth to feed, another check in the mail. She learned to be quiet, to make herself small, to live in the margins of someone else's life. Her sketchbook became her only confidant, its pages filled with the things she couldn't say. A drawing of a sad-eyed cat, a sketch of a window with bars made of rain. When she drew a picture of her foster mother with a mouth zipped shut, she was moved. The second home was loud, filled with the shouting of a man who smelled of stale beer and regret. She learned to read the rhythm of his moods, to disappear into her closet with her sketchbook when his voice grew heavy. She drew monsters with his face, their shadows stretching long and menacing across the page. A teacher saw the drawings. She was moved again. The third home was clean and cold, with a couple who wanted a perfect little girl to complete their perfect life. They bought her new clothes she was afraid to get dirty, and toys she didn't know how to play with. They told her to stop drawing such morbid things and to smile more. "No one likes a sad child," the woman would say, her voice as brittle as glass. Maya tried to smile, but it felt like a costume she couldn't quite fit into. She drew pictures of herself as a doll, her face a perfect painted-on smile, her eyes empty. That placement ended when they decided they wanted to try for a child of their own after all. Now she was at the Northwood group home, a final stop for the children the system couldn't place. It was a place of institutional beige walls and the lingering scent of disinfectant. Here, silence wasn't just a survival tactic, it was the atmosphere. The other children were, like her, islands of private grief. They learned early on that vulnerability was a weakness, that relying on anyone, especially an adult, was a fool's errand. The staff, though not cruel, were stretched thin, managing crises, not nurturing children. Maya's silence was mistaken for compliance. Her self-reliance was seen as resilience. No one looked closely enough to see the loneliness etched into the faces of the children she drew, the quiet desperation in their eyes. She was, for all intents and purposes, invisible, and for a long time she thought that was the safest way to be. Until today, until the twitching finger in the dirt reminded her that being invisible meant no one could hear you scream, and no one would come looking if you were the one who got buried. The distant thunder grew into a low, guttural roar, the sound of a dozen heavy engines moving in unison. A line of motorcycles crested the hill, a phalanx of chrome and black leather shimmering in the heat haze. They moved with a disciplined grace that was more like a military procession than a joyride. At their head rode a man with a presence that seemed to bend the air around him. His cut bore the insignia of the Sons of Odin Motorcycle Club, a stylized raven, its wings spread wide. This was Saint, the club's president. The Sons of Odin were not what most people thought of when they heard the words biker gang. They were veterans, ex-cops, mechanics, and businessmen, bound by a code stricter than any corporate handbook. Their clubhouse was not a den of vice, but a fortress of loyalty. Their weekly meetings, held around a massive oak table carved with the names of fallen brothers, were run with parliamentary procedure. They organized charity drives, provided security for community events, and had a zero-tolerance policy for the kind of predatory crime that gave clubs like theirs a bad name. Their motto, etched in leather and lived in deed, was simple: Fortis fortuna adiuvat, fortune favors the brave. But they had their own translation: we protect our own, and we define who is our own. Today there was no charity. There was a grim purpose to their ride. One of their own, a man they called Grizz, was missing. Grizz was the club's soul, a giant of a man with a laugh that could shake rafters and a gentleness that made him the designated favorite uncle to every child in their extended family. He was a carpenter, his hands as skilled at building a cradle as they were at rebuilding an engine. 2 days ago, he had gone to meet a man about a contract to build some custom gazebos on a newly purchased plot of land. He never came back. His phone went straight to voicemail. His truck was found abandoned on a service road, keys in the ignition, his wallet and phone gone. It looked like a carjacking, but the Sons knew better. Grizz wouldn't have given up his truck without a fight, and there were no signs of one. Saint signaled and the formation slowed. engines dropping to a rumbling idle. They were retracing Grizz's last known route, beside St. Road Forge, the road captain, his mind a map of every backroad and dirt track in the county. Behind them was Doc, a former combat medic whose saddlebags held more medical supplies than spare parts, and Counsel, a retired lawyer whose sharpest weapon was his intellect. They were a unit, each man a piece of a functioning whole. They had spent 48 hours searching, calling in favors and pressing quiet inquiries in places the police couldn't go. They had found nothing. A cold dread was beginning to settle over them, the unspoken fear that they were no longer looking for a brother, but for a body. Saint scanned the desolate landscape, his gaze missing nothing. The new fence, the freshly graded land, the sterile sign announcing Finch Luxury Estates. It all felt wrong, too clean, too quiet. It was then that he saw her, a small, skinny girl standing on the shoulder of the road, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her face pale with a terror so profound it was almost silent. Maya stood frozen as the motorcycles pulled to a stop, their engines a collective pulsing heartbeat. The man at the front swung his leg off his bike with an easy grace. He was tall and broad, his face etched with lines that spoke of long miles and eye-hard sun. He wore a leather cut covered in patches, but his eyes were what held her. They were calm and clear, and they looked at her not as a problem or an inconvenience, but as a person. He took off his sunglasses, and she saw no anger, no impatience, only a quiet, focused attention. "You okay, little one?" he asked, his voice a low rumble, surprisingly gentle. Maya's throat was tight, the words trapped behind a wall of fear. She could only shake her head, a tiny, jerky motion. She pointed a trembling finger toward the pines, toward the ugly scar on the land. Saint's eyes followed her gesture. He saw nothing but trees and dirt. "What is it? Did you see something over there?" She nodded, her whole body trembling now. The fear of what she had seen warred with the lifelong habit of staying silent. Don't get involved. Don't be a nuisance. But the image of that struggling finger burned behind her eyes. She took a ragged breath and found her voice, a small, reedy whisper. "A hand," she choked out. "I saw a hand." The air grew still. The rumbling engines seemed to fade into the background. Saint exchanged a look with Forge. It was a look that communicated volumes. This is it. This is where he is. Saint knelt, bringing himself down to her level. His knees cracked, but his gaze never wavered. "A hand? Can you show us where?" She nodded again, tears welling in her eyes, blurring the formidable man into a dark, protective shape. He didn't doubt her. He didn't dismiss her. He believed her. That simple act of belief was like a key turning a lock deep inside her. The words, so long held captive, began to tumble out. "The dirt is new, and there was a smell, like wet pennies." The detail was strange, specific, the kind of thing a child would notice, the smell of blood. She also remembered something else. The night before, she had been unable to sleep, staring out the group home window that overlooked the back of the construction site. She had seen headlights, a truck where no truck should be. It was a big, dark green truck, she remembered, with a strange logo on the side, a golden bird of some kind. And she'd heard a voice, a man's voice, angry and sharp on the quiet night air. He'd said something she didn't understand at the time. He'd said, "He'll be part of the foundation now." As she relayed this, her voice gaining a small measure of strength, she saw the look on the man's face change. The calm focus hardened into something colder, something dangerous. "A green truck with a golden bird?" Saint asked, his voice tight. Forge, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "Finch Development. Their logo is a golden phoenix." The pieces clicked into place with sickening certainty. Alistair Finch. the wealthy developer who had bought the land, the man Grizz was supposed to meet. Saint stood up, his gaze now fixed on the pristine sign for the luxury estates. He turned back to Maya, his expression softening once more. "You did a very brave thing," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "What's your name?" "Maya," she whispered. "Well, Maya," he said, placing a large, warm hand gently on her shoulder, "you just saved a man's life." He turned to his brothers. "Doc, get your kit. Forge, call 911. Tell them we have a man buried alive. The rest of you, with me." The sons of Odin moved as one, a wave of determined muscle and leather, following the small, trembling girl toward the trees. They moved with the urgency of men who knew that every second was a lifetime. Within minutes, the clearing was a scene of controlled chaos. Doc was directing the careful removal of dirt, his commands sharp and precise, while others dug with their bare hands, their faces grim. They uncovered Grizz's face first. He was unconscious, his skin a deathly blue, but a faint flutter of his eyelids told them he was still with them. As the paramedics arrived, their sirens wailing in the distance, Saint walked back to where Maya stood, huddled near his motorcycle, a silent observer to the life-and-death drama she had set in motion. He draped his own leather cut over her shoulders. It was absurdly large, smelling of leather, road dust, and engine oil, but it was the warmest, safest thing she had ever felt. An hour later, Grizz was on his way to the hospital, alive but in critical condition. The clearing was cordoned off with police tape, and a weary-looking detective named Miller was taking statements. He eyed the bikers with a practiced suspicion, his questions clipped and professional. When it was Saint's turn, he kept his answers brief and factual, his gaze repeatedly drifting to the man who had just arrived in a sleek, black sedan. Alistair Finch stepped out of his car, the picture of tailored concern. He was handsome, his suit expensive, his smile polished. He approached Detective Miller with an outstretched hand, expressing his shock and horror at what had happened on his property. "My God, Detective," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "Is the man all right? I was supposed to meet with him, a contractor, I believe. He never showed. I assumed he'd simply changed his mind." Saint watched, his face an unreadable mask, but inside, a cold fury was building. He saw the way Finch's eyes flickered toward the excavation site, a micro-expression of irritation, not shock. He saw the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. This was the man from the green truck. This was the man who had buried his brother alive and was now preparing to play the part of the concerned citizen. Detective Miller, a man who had seen his share of liars, was non-committal. "We're looking into it, Mr. Finch. Do you know of anyone who might have had a grudge against this man?" "Absolutely not," Finch said, shaking his head with practiced sympathy. "We had a pleasant phone call, that's all. This is a tragedy, a random act of violence, no doubt. This area has been going downhill for years. It's why my development is so crucial." He was already spinning the narrative, turning a murder attempt into a sales pitch for his gated community. Saint stepped forward, his shadow falling over Finch. "You drive a green truck, Finch?" he asked, his voice low and even. Finch turned, his polished smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "I have a fleet of vehicles for my company, yes. Several are green. Why?" "Your logo is a phoenix, isn't it? A golden bird," Saint continued, ignoring the question. Finch's eyes narrowed. "It is. It symbolizes rebirth, the renewal of this community." "Funny," Saint said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a gravelly sound that carried more menace than a shout. "Some things, once you bury them, should stay dead." A flicker of genuine fear crossed Finch's face before it was replaced by indignant bluster. "I have no idea what you're implying. Detective, is this man a suspect? Or is he allowed to harass me on my own property? Detective Miller stepped between them. All right, that's enough. We'll handle the questions. But he had seen it too. The flicker of fear, the carefully constructed facade cracking at the edges. He looked from the smooth, wealthy developer to the stoic biker, and then to the small girl wrapped in a leather jacket, her eyes wide and watchful. His cop's intuition, honed over 20 years of service, told him the truth was not standing in the expensive suit. Saint backed away, giving a slight nod. The confrontation was over for now, but the war had just begun. He knew Finch would have lawyers, connections, and a story so polished it would shine. But the Sons of Odin had something Finch couldn't buy. They had loyalty, they had patience, and they had a 10-year-old witness with eyes that saw everything. The investigation began to move, but with the frustrating slowness of a bureaucracy, wary of a powerful man like Alistair Finch. Finch had an alibi, a dinner meeting with city council members, all of whom confirmed he was charming and generous. His fleet of green trucks was vast, and he claimed the one seen near. The property must have been stolen and later returned, a story his high-priced lawyers were already busy cementing. Detective Miller was methodical, but his hands were tied by a lack of hard evidence. The crime scene had been compromised by the rescue, and Grizz, still in a medically induced coma, couldn't tell them what happened. The only clear voice in the fog was Maya's. Miller arranged for a forensic interview with a child specialist in a soft-lit room with comfortable chairs and a box of crayons. Saint and counsel from the Sons of Odin insisted on being present, not in the room, but just outside the one-way glass. They wanted the system to know that Maya was not alone. Maya sat at a small table, her hands folded in her lap. The interviewer, a kind woman named Dr. Evans, spoke in a gentle, reassuring voice. She didn't press. She simply asked Maya to draw. Sometimes, she said, it's easier to draw our memories than to say them. Maya picked up a black crayon. Her hand, which had been trembling, grew steady. She began to draw the scene as she remembered it from her window. She drew the dark shape of the truck, and with a brown crayon she drew the mound of earth. Then she picked up a green crayon and drew the truck again, this time adding the detail she hadn't mentioned before. On the driver's side door, just below the Golden Phoenix logo, there was a long, jagged scratch in the paint, shaped like a lightning bolt. It was shiny underneath, she said softly, her crayon tracing the silver of the exposed metal, like a scar. Behind the glass, counsel wrote furiously on a notepad. Detective Miller leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the drawing. A scratch. That was tangible. That was something they could look for. Maya wasn't done. She drew the man standing by the truck. He was on the phone, his back partially to her, but she remembered his profile, the sharp line of his jaw illuminated by the phone's screen. And she drew something else. In his hand, he held a shovel. She switched to a red crayon and drew the shovel's handle. It was red, she whispered, a bright red, like a fire truck. Miller's phone buzzed. It was a patrol officer he'd tasked with a discreet canvass of the area, an elderly man who lived a quarter-mile from the construction site, a notorious night owl, remembered being woken by an argument. He couldn't make out the words, but he remembered two voices. One was deep and booming, angry. The other was smoother, colder. The argument ended abruptly. Then he heard the sound of a heavy engine. The pieces were starting to form a picture. Counsel, using his old legal connections, filed a civil discovery motion on behalf of Grizz's family, demanding access to Finch's vehicle maintenance logs. It was a long shot, a legal maneuver designed to rattle Finch, but it showed they wouldn't be passive. The Brotherhood worked their own angles. Forge, a master of logistics, began mapping out the GPS data from Grizz's abandoned truck. cross-referencing it with cell tower pings from Finch's phone. The data was circumstantial, but it painted a timeline that directly contradicted Finch's alibi. He had claimed to be at a downtown restaurant, but for a crucial 45-minute window, his phone had pinged a tower near the construction site. Meanwhile, another ally emerged from an unexpected place. Maya's teacher, Mrs. Gable, had been worried about her for weeks. She had seen the darkness creeping into Maya's drawings, the way she flinched from loud noises. When she heard about the incident on the news, she knew Maya was the unnamed child witness. She went to the police. She brought them Maya's sketchbook from the past month. In it, page after page showed drawings of the woods behind the group home. In the most recent ones, a figure appeared, a man in a suit watching from the trees. Maya had seen Finch surveying the property days before the attack. She hadn't known who he was, but she had captured his likeness with an unnerving accuracy, right down to the expensive watch on his wrist. The evidence was a tapestry woven from a child's memory, a biker's intuition, and a detective's persistence. Finch's pristine world was beginning to show cracks. Miller now had enough to get a warrant, not for Finch's arrest, not yet, but to search his fleet of vehicles. The hunt for a green truck with a lightning bolt scratch and a red-handled shovel was on. The news of Grizz's assault and Maya's discovery spread through the city. At first, the narrative was the one Finch's public relations team was pushing. A tragic, random attack highlighting the need for his secure, gated community. The Sons of Odin were portrayed as a menacing biker gang, inserting themselves into a police investigation. But the story began to shift. Local news outlets, intrigued by the David and Goliath angle, started digging deeper. They interviewed members of the community who knew the Sons not as criminals, but as the guys who organized the annual toy run for the Children's Hospital and stood guard at funerals for fallen soldiers. Saint, understanding the power of perception, agreed to a single, carefully controlled television interview. He didn't speak of revenge. He spoke of brotherhood, of loyalty, and of a brave little girl who did the right thing when every adult in her life had taught her to stay silent. Strength isn't about how loud your pipes are or how tough you look, he said, his gaze steady and direct into the camera. It's about who you stand up for when they can't stand for themselves. We're not going anywhere until there's justice for our brother and for Maya. His words resonated. The community, initially wary, began to see the situation not as a gang dispute, but as a fight for the soul of their town. People started showing up at the clubhouse not with fear, but with casseroles and offers of help. A Justice for Grizz Facebook page appeared, gaining thousands of followers overnight. Maya's drawing of the scratched truck, leaked to a friendly reporter by an anonymous source, became a viral symbol of the search for truth. The Sons decided it was time to escalate. They needed to keep the pressure on, to show Finch and the city officials he had in his pocket that this would not be swept under the rug. Forge called a meeting of the presidents of every allied motorcycle club in the state. The plan was audacious, a silent, peaceful, and utterly overwhelming demonstration. The morning of the ride, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. They started gathering at dawn in the parking lot of a shuttered stadium on the outskirts of the city. They came from all corners of the state, a rolling tide of chrome and steel. The Sons of Odin, the Iron Disciples, the Devil's Brigade, the Forgotten Few, clubs that were sometimes rivals, now united by a common purpose. There were sport bikes, cruisers, and custom choppers, old men with long gray braids and young veterans with fresh scars. By 8 a.m., there were over 900 motorcycles, their engines silent, the air thick with anticipation. At the front of the formation was Saint. On the back of his bike, in a specially secured seat, sat Maya. She wore a small, custom-made leather cut with a single patch on the back, a small, fierce-looking bird, a sparrow, her road name. She was terrified, but as she looked at the sea of bikers behind her, she also felt a sense of belonging she had never known. These were her people. This was her family. At precisely 8:30 a.m. on a signal from Forge, 900 engines roared to life in a single deafening explosion of sound that shook the very ground. Then just as quickly, they settled into a low, synchronized rumble. They pulled out onto the highway, taking up all 4 lanes. They rode slowly, deliberately, a massive, unstoppable river of metal. Traffic ground to a halt for miles. People got out of their cars, not with anger, but with awe, their cell phones held high, recording the incredible spectacle. News helicopters hovered overhead, broadcasting the scene live. Their destination was City Hall. They didn't shout, they didn't make threats. They simply parked their bikes, filling the entire plaza, and stood in silent formation. 900 men and women in leather, a silent, unmovable testament to solidarity. The message was clear: we are here, we are watching, and we will not be ignored. The public reckoning had begun. The highway shutdown was a tipping point. The image of 900 bikers standing in silent, disciplined protest was broadcast across the nation. City Hall was inundated with calls. The mayor, who had previously dismissed the incident as a police matter, was forced to hold a press conference, promising a full and thorough investigation. The pressure on Detective Miller's department intensified, but now it was the kind of pressure that opened doors and expedited warrants. The search of Finch's vehicle depot took place the next day. Lined up in a pristine garage were 24 dark green trucks. Miller and his team, armed with Maya's drawing, started their inspection. They found it on the 14th truck, parked in a back corner as if someone had tried to hide it. A long, jagged scratch on the driver's side door just below the Golden Phoenix. Under a spectroscope, the lab confirmed traces of the specific paint used on Grizz's motorcycle. Inside the truck's unlocked toolbox, they found it, a shovel with a bright red handle. The blade was caked with a specific type of clay soil, the same type found at the burial site. Forensic analysis would later find microscopic traces of Grizz's blood on the handle. Alistair Finch was arrested at his downtown office, escorted out in handcuffs in front of the same news cameras that had once filmed his philanthropic galas. His face was a mask of cold fury, his polished veneer finely shattered. The motive, as it unraveled, was as petty as it was brutal. Grizz, a master carpenter, had been inspecting the land for the gazebo project when he discovered an old, forgotten well. Inside, he found sealed barrels. He confronted Finch, suspecting illegal dumping of toxic waste from a previous Finch development. Finch, whose entire renewal project was a house of cards built on cutting corners and burying mistakes, couldn't risk the exposure. The argument the neighbor heard was Grizz threatening to go to the authorities. Finch, in a fit of rage and panic, struck him with the shovel and, believing him dead or dying, buried him, planning to pour a concrete foundation over the site within a week. The trial was a media circus. Finch's lawyers tried to paint the Sons of Odin as a violent gang framing their client, and Maya as an unreliable, traumatized child. But the evidence was overwhelming. The scratch on the truck, the shovel, the soil analysis, the cell phone data, and the damning testimony from the chemical analysis of the barrels found in the well, it all formed an unbreakable chain. The prosecution's star witness was Grizz. He had woken from his coma with a fractured memory, but under careful questioning, the events of that day came back to him. He remembered the argument, the glint of the sun on the shovel, the sickening thud, and then darkness. His testimony, delivered in a low, gravelly voice, was powerful. He spoke not of anger, but of a deep sadness for a man who would trade a human life for a profit margin. Maya did not have to testify in open court. Counsel, working with the district attorney, successfully argued that it would be too traumatic. Instead, Her videotaped forensic interview was played for the jury. The courtroom fell silent as they watched the small girl with the steady hand draw the lightning bolt scratch and the red-handled shovel. Her quiet, unwavering voice, describing what she had seen with such simple clarity, was more compelling than any lawyer's argument. It was the unvarnished truth. The jury returned a verdict in less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts: attempted murder, illegal disposal of hazardous waste, and a string of other charges. Alistair Finch, the man who had tried to build an empire on buried secrets, was sentenced to life in prison. As he was led away, his eyes met Saint's across the crowded courtroom. There was no remorse in his gaze, only cold, impotent hatred. Saint simply looked back, his expression unchanging, a silent promise kept. Justice had been delivered. The conviction of Alistair Finch was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a profound transformation. The trial had unearthed more than just Finch's crimes. It had exposed deep cracks in the systems that were supposed to protect the city's most vulnerable. The illegal dumping on the development site led to a full-scale environmental investigation, uncovering a pattern of corruption that implicated several city officials and led to a massive federally mandated cleanup. The land, once destined for luxury estates, was seized by the state. The spotlight also fell on the Northwood Group home. The media attention on Maya's story prompted a state-level inquiry into the foster care system. Maya's file, a thick manila folder detailing years of neglect and instability, became Exhibit A. Her quiet drawings, once dismissed as morbid fantasies, were now seen as cries for help that had gone unanswered. The investigation led to a complete overhaul of the regional child protective services. New regulations were passed, mandating smaller child-to-caseworker ratios, increased funding for mental health support, and stricter oversight of group homes. It became known informally as Maya's Law. The Sons of Odin, now hailed as community heroes, used their newfound influence for good. They partnered with a local land trust to petition the state. Their proposal was to turn the contaminated, reclaimed Finch property into a community park and youth center. They organized fundraisers drawing on the massive wave of public support. Local construction unions donated labor and businesses contributed materials. Grizz, now fully recovered, designed the main building himself, a beautiful wooden lodge with wide windows and a soaring ceiling. He called it the Sparrow's Nest. The center became a haven for at-risk youth, offering after-school programs, mentorship, and art therapy classes taught by a volunteer, Mrs. Gable. It was a place where quiet children could be heard, where their drawings were not just seen, but celebrated. The brotherhood became a constant protective presence. They taught motorcycle mechanics to restless teenagers, organized camping trips, and provided a sense of stability and family for kids who had none. They had defined their own, and their own now included an entire generation of children the world had tried to forget. The legacy of that one brave act rippled outward, changing policies, reshaping the landscape, and rebuilding a community's trust in itself. It was a testament to the fact that sometimes the most significant changes don't start in boardrooms or legislative halls, but with a small child who stops to look at a patch of disturbed earth and decides to do the right thing. The world was safer, not just for Maya, but for countless other children, because one person, against all odds, had refused to look away. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard behind the Sons of Odin clubhouse. The air smelled of barbecue smoke and freshly cut grass. The rumble of motorcycles was a constant, comforting backdrop, not the roar of a highway, but the gentle thrum of bikes being tuned and polished in the garage. This was the sound of home. Maya sat at a wooden picnic table, her sketchbook open. She was no longer drawing monsters or shadowed figures. Today she was drawing a family portrait. It was a large, sprawling picture. In the center was a giant, smiling bear of a man, Grizz, flipping burgers at a grill. Beside him was Saint, his arms crossed, a small, quiet smile on his face. Surrounding them were the other members of the Brotherhood, Forge, Doc, Council, and a dozen others, each rendered with loving detail, their cuts adorned with the raven insignia. In the corner of the drawing she drew herself, not small and hiding, but right in the middle of the group, holding Saint's hand. She wore her own tiny leather cut, the sparrow patch on the back clearly visible. She was no longer a resident of the Northwood group home. After the trial, Saint and his wife Sarah had petitioned to become her legal guardians. The system, so recently overhauled and under intense scrutiny, had fast-tracked the process. She now lived in a quiet house with a big yard, a room of her own with a window that looked out onto a garden, not a construction site. For the first time in her life, she knew what it felt like to unpack a suitcase and put her clothes in a drawer, knowing she wouldn't have to pack it all up again in a few months. Grizz walked over, a plate piled high with a burger and fries in his massive hands. He set it down in front of her. "The artist must be fed," he said, his voice a warm, rumbling laugh. The scars on his head were still visible, but his eyes were clear and full of life. He looked down at her drawing. "Hey, you made me look handsome," he chuckled. "You're a miracle worker, kid." Maya smiled, a real easy smile that reached her eyes. "You are handsome, Grizz." He ruffled her hair gently. "Not as handsome as your work. You've got a real gift, Maya." He walked back to the grill, his steps even and strong. Later, as dusk settled and the fireflies began to blink in the tall grass, Saint came and sat beside her. He didn't say anything for a long time, just watched the sunset with her. The silence between them was comfortable, a shared space of peace. "You know," he said finally, his voice quiet, "we have a saying in the club. One warrior, properly armed and motivated, can change the world. I never really knew what it meant until I met you." She looked up at him, her small face serious in the fading light. "I wasn't armed," she said. "Yes, you were," he replied, tapping his finger gently on her sketchbook. "You had your eyes, you had your memory, and you had a courage bigger than this whole sky. That's better than any weapon." He handed her a small, flat box. She opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was a silver pendant on a chain. It was a raven, its wings spread wide, just like the one on their cuts, but smaller, more delicate. In its talons, it clutched a tiny, perfectly carved sparrow. Tears welled in her eyes, but for the first time in her life, they were not tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of gratitude. She threw her arms around Saint's neck, burying her face in the familiar, safe scent of his leather jacket. "Thank you," she whispered. He held her close. "No, Maya," he said, his voice thick. "Thank you." The party wound down. The brothers started to mount their bikes, their engines rumbling to life one by one, a chorus of controlled power. They weren't leaving for good, just heading home for the night. They would be back tomorrow. They would always be back. Saint lifted her up and set her on the seat of his bike in front of him for the short ride home. As they pulled out of the clubhouse driveway and onto the open road, the cool night air rushing past them, Maya looked back at the warm lights of the clubhouse, a beacon in the darkness. She was safe. She was loved. She was home. The world was a better place, a little bit brighter because someone had finally paid attention to the quiet girl who drew pictures. And the sons of Odin rode on, their promise kept, guardians on a highway stretching toward a new dawn.